Welcome everyone. I think there's more to come, but there's a good chunk of people here. Today, as we talked about last time, we're putting Jim right. Instead of letting him swan around in the background and come up with really tricky questions for everyone, we're putting Jim front and center, and feel free as we talk in his initial bits to come up with the trickiest questions you can. Let's put him in the hot seat and really give him a grilling. But what we talked about was, it's really over the last couple of years, we've seen a bit of a resurgence in interest and a bit of clarity around chaos, and a lot of people are going, oh, I really get this now. This might be absolutely what I've been trying to explain. And when we were talking about what this session should be called, we discussed it's really chaos seen clearly for the first time. So we really want to dig into the chaos theory, where it's at, where it's going, and some of the applications of it. Before we do that, for those people who have just joined, please drop in the chat who you are and context and where you're zooming in from. But before we dive in and ask Jim the questions, really want to get a view from everyone here. How have the last 2 years been for you in one word? So grab your phone and use that QR code and just give us a taste of how it's been. I know people are in different contexts. We speak with, from a Become point of view, we work with a diverse section of schools and teachers and leaders every day. So we kind of get a feel, but I think we've got a real diversity of backgrounds here. So it'd be really good to get a feel. And hopefully that starts to build. I'm going to click 2. Let's hope some answers are coming through. Is that working for everybody? Relentless, challenging. Okay. I like the okay. It's not positive.
Wow, I've got a challenging audience here with draining, yes, stressful, challenging, relentless, and they're just describing me.
Jim, what's that saying to you?
Saying to me, I probably should make my excuses and go down the pub. I think it's going to be
give
like
everyone a coffee voucher.
Yes, I think I've got a hard audience. What it's saying to me is that change and uncertainty is disturbing and has fatigue associated with it. And in a sense, I think that is exacerbated by the expectations that we've been encouraged to foster about how the world is. I think that we are fundamentally changing our sense of what the world is like. And our expectation is it's going to be stable and predictable. And it is not as stable and predictable as we've been led to believe. And I think there's a whole bunch of different, I suppose, reasons for that. And some of them are also historical quirks of being exceedingly lucky if you believe that living in unchanging times is lucky. For at least in terms of negative shocks, for some of us, depending on where you've been in the world. I remember my late father, who died about 10 years ago, was involved in World War II, and had experiences at high school of being a fire warden in Coventry, which was a city that was very heavily bombed. And literally he was on duty as in his sixth form years, in year 11 and 12, on the roof of the building watching bombs dropping around the city, and he was there with a bucket to put out a fire. And there he was, equipped at that age, 16, 17, before he then joined the Navy and joined the war effort, right? And thankfully, many of us have grown up free from that kind of thing. And of course, now our friends in Europe are being thrown back into that with the Ukrainian situation. Some who are a little bit younger than my father, but older than perhaps a few of us, would have been exposed to Vietnam and so forth. It's not like their conflicts have never existed. They have, of course. But for many of us, we've been free of all of that. So that's one form of uncertainty that many of us have not personally experienced. And even, in fact, you know, I was the youngest in my family, and my father was quite old when I was born. So even people of my age may not have parents who have had that kind of wartime experience. Right now, locally, well, not just locally in Australia, but around the world, interest rates are going up. And, you know, the whole generation of people who have bought homes have never experienced an interest rate rise. So that's another kind of negative factor. And that's without talking about, you know, the great unmentionable pandemic, you know. So even before we get to that little doozy, there have been lots of other events which may well be in some senses related or exacerbating each other, which have created this tremendous sense of uncertainty. In fact, downstairs from where I'm sort of broadcasting from now, I have a couple of my father's oil lamps that were last used in anger in the energy crisis of 73, was it, in the UK, which I remember, which we went to a 3-day week because you couldn't afford people to travel and there were power cuts. And my father had these oil lamps, so we kept the lights on that way, because people would knock on the door and say, "How come you got your lights on?" And it was because of that, because there were power cuts. So it's funny that even in my lifetime, these things are coming around again, and we're now being, you know, last night in New South Wales, we were advised to switch off electricity where we possibly could because of possible outages, and it's having all kinds of impacts. So there's a whole bunch of reasons why people might find it difficult, but I would say part of the problem is a failure of us as counsellors and educators and in society generally to actually get people to appreciate the limits of our control and the fact that we are living in an inherently uncertain world. And I think that lesson keeps getting forgotten, because we are suckers for literally wanting to stick our thumbs in our mouth, suck on our thumb while we're told a story about how it all ends happily ever after, how everything unfolds in a very predictable way, and everything will be all right. We all want our mommy to say everything will be all right. Is that kind of Freudian kind of connection. And again, you know, on a very health crisis, that we're okay one day and, you know, maybe the next day or the few months later, we're not well at all. And maybe sadly, some of us won't be here. And that happens. And it doesn't just happen to people who are sort of, you know, getting towards the end of a natural lifespan on average. It can happen to us at any time. It can happen to us crossing a road, driving a car, riding a motorcycle or bicycle. It can happen to young kids running around on a sports field, tragically. Side to all of this as well is all of those opportunities that come along. The fact that we're using this technology now to do this stuff, the fact that we can tap into learning opportunities around the world as people are here, in a way that we didn't really come to grips with before COVID, is a great opportunity. I mean, yes, people were doing this, of course, but not to the extent that they are now. And the skills they've picked up along the way, being able to conduct Zoom meetings or whatever, you know, it's just one small example of what I believe is a step forward. And one of I started when I left university, when I graduated from psychology at Nottingham University in 1989, I went to work for a company called Castle Rock Consultants, just over the road in the Science Park. And they were a civil engineering company who were applying information technology in the 80s to solve traffic problems like traffic congestion and pollution problems from traffic in Athens, for instance, was one of the things, or traffic congestion in London or the major cities. So anyone who's got a little tag on their car, which deducts money from their account when they go over a bridge or into a city centre, the company I work for were developing those things. And I worked on projects to see how people would react to those way back in the 80s. And when my very first project I was put on was on the impacts of what was called telecommuting. In other words, working from home and using computers to dial in. Now, this is the 1980s. Any of you who are on this line who are old enough to sort of been working in the 80s will remember what the computers were like that, and the modems, and even simply the graphics packages called Harvard Graphics, the precursor to PowerPoint, to produce these little box diagrams to try to illustrate to people in the European Union who I was doing the work for what it would look like to work from home, and with sort of old, like almost the RKO film beginnings, with the beams coming off a big broadcasting tower into someone's home magically. And we were talking about how that would impact traffic congestion. Here we are. It's only really in the last couple of years that we've fully embraced telecommuting, and it has been revolutionary. And we're now dealing with, short-sighted, recalcitrant, provocative, Victorian era bosses like Elon Musk and others who are demanding that we must go back into the office. And that is an increasing chorus, despite the research suggesting we can be, in many cases, very productive working from home. So there are lots of benefits of uncertainty as well as all of the negatives. So, that's a very long-winded way of sort of saying, I think we continue to be unprepared for uncertainty. And I think bringing it home to career development, we are still tied to Victorian era ideas about what career education and what career coaching counseling is about, and we're still obsessed with neat and tidy Victorian students who all leave on a very clear path with a piece of paper in their hands, which is going to determine the rest of their lives. It's always been a fantasy, and I think that is being brutally exposed. But do not underestimate the tenacity to which people will stick to the familiar, stick to that which they've been brought up with and trained, rather than embracing new approaches. And I have to say, our field are as guilty of that as any other professional field, which is deeply ironic given we're in the change business.
Yeah, I mean, I think now there's been such a, we've talked about, even before COVID, we had 10 years of future of work conferences and people talking about how different everything was going to be. It's almost like we've known things were going to be different, but it's always had change, chance, complexity at an individual level. It feels like this 2 years is our chance that everybody saw it at once, because we were all going through it together rather than one country or one individual. But yes, it feels like now is the time to go, what do we really take forward from this? And from a careers education point of view and career development point of view, you're right. It's like, how do we learn that lesson once and for all? And like, how scary do you think it would be for, and I'd love to hear from people on the chat, how scary do you think this world looks now for young adults looking forward, in terms of how uncertain it was when they've been probably told, careers are linear and you'll get to the end of school and then you'll make a decision and don't worry about it till then. How do you think it looks for them now? And love to put your comments in the chat about your views on how this has impacted young people to see this absolute clarity that things are uncertain.
I mean, I used to use the example of the 9/11 terrorist attack having all kinds of implications around the world. For instance, it led to security guards being employed to patrol the Sydney Harbour Bridge, but it also led to the collapse of a couple of airlines and pilots for Air New Zealand being made redundant when flights suddenly stopped for a period of time after that, causing problems with tourism and things like that. But that was, those examples I used then had I don't know, 1/1,000,000th of the impact compared to COVID, for instance, which came later. But even I felt those things were compelling, and those things are very old, those examples now, in relation. But then we sort of settle down again and we think we're on top of it. In the same way with COVID, we think, right, great, AstraZeneca is actually good again. We've got we've got a vaccine, we're indestructible, we can get through this, despite the fact there's more people now dying of COVID on a daily basis than there were, back in the day. It's amazing how human beings become resilient and adopt to this, I hate that expression, but the new normal. Life kind of goes on. I remember my grandmother talking about this in the Blitz and going into bomb shelters and things like that. And life went on. Laundry still had to be done. Meals had to be prepared. Kids had to be educated, despite the bombs dropping. It just provided much more interesting playgrounds.
Yeah.
So that kind of adaptability thing sometimes leads us to sort of think that we are more in control than we really are. Now, my job is not to go around scaring people. I remember Mark Savickas, it was a good-natured dig, but it was a dig at a conference in Queensland saying, Robert Pryor and Jim Bright believe in chaos, but I want to sleep at night. And I can completely understand that you sort of say everything is uncertain. Not everything is completely uncertain and is changing radically all of the time. And it's not always happening fast either. Sometimes these changes are very slow. So, you've got a reasonable chance that the ceiling in your bedroom's not going to fall in on you overnight, probably, but you can't completely guarantee it. But on the other hand, you can't live your life as though it will happen every night. Otherwise, you'd never go to bed, you'd never sleep. So, it's not like we're trying to say the world is totally random and unstructured. And that's one of the great problems with this label chaos, which we use for the theory, because it comes out of mathematics, it comes out of evolutionary biology. It's not our term, but we made the decision very early on to call it the chaos theory of careers because we wanted people to be clear about the intellectual pedigree of the work and its inheritance, and the fact that we didn't invent chaos theory, and the label's a lousy label for the theory, but we didn't invent it. But that's the label that's been used. It has provocative worth, but it's a marketing nightmare for people, for instance, practically in schools and things like that, and for a politician to say we're going to embrace a chaos approach. Well, with the exception of Boris Johnson, most people would find that unpalatable.
Absolutely. Become our program in schools is absolutely based on the chaos theory and preparing people for that uncertainty and facing uncertainty head on and being equipped to adapt to it. But you've stolen my thunder on one of my tricky questions I had up my sleeve for you, which is, do you ever wish you hadn't called it chaos? Just because of that, because of people latch on to the fear of it. And it goes to Bev's question there, people convincing themselves that the change is unusual and that linear and predictable paths are normal.
Yeah, I mean, I prefer it to the label that my friend and colleague Rob Pryor wanted to call it originally, which was the natural theory, which I thought sounded terribly smug. But what he was getting at was nature and the idea of this theory captures how processes work in nature, and things are continually changing in nature. Plants are constantly growing, grass needs cutting, branches are growing, tides ebb and flow, etc. Things are constantly changing and reproducing and all of this sort of stuff. And that's kind of what we are. We're natural. We need to think about ourselves in this kind of natural state and the systems that we find ourselves in. And that is a really big shift that we still haven't made. And it's interesting because culturally, Western culture has developed this dominant theme of individualism, which has been corrosive. One of the things that have changed over the last 50 or 60 years, or 100 years certainly, ever since we've had psychometric personality testing, is that people are scoring higher on narcissism than they did when these tests were developed in the 40s and 50s. All right. So I don't go into this generational stuff. I think that we don't change that much, and I don't think people are mutations. But younger generations are coming up higher on narcissism, says the man who's got his own Instagram account, right? So there are exceptions to that. But that individualism is dangerous because it promotes this notion of individual agency to such an extreme and such a distortion that it leads people to these nonsense that you hear. You see this in schools and conferences, these ghastly unethical motivational speakers who don't really understand what they're saying when they come out with statements like, you can do anything, you can be anything you want if you try hard enough. Notice it's all about you. It's all about personal agency. If you work hard, you will do well. Now, it's interesting. I heard the US politician Bernie Sanders a couple of days ago talking about his fears that America is turning into an oligarchic society. In other words, a few billionaires have undue financial and political influence to change things. Now, you think again back to Elon Musk thinking about buying Twitter and allowing Donald Trump back on. That's the kind of influence that people with very significant amount of money has that really led to this meritocracy? Has it really led to, yes, if you try hard, you can make it? Or is it a case of, well, actually power is increasingly in the hands of relatively few? If we look at what's going on in Russia, I mean, is that, people might have said the Soviet Union, well, the power was in the party and in the Kremlin. Has it really changed? Now, I'm not an expert on these things, but I think but this individualism has seemed to be seeing the rise of dictators in the 20th and 21st century, and the sort of power being held in small groups of elites. And I think that is a real problem. I mean, people like David Bluestein and Ronald Santana and Tristan Hooley have talked about social justice in career development brilliantly. And I think they're really making a point about the broader societal position. And is it all down to you? Are you a failure because you haven't tried hard enough? That's the corollary of this notion of, if you try hard, you'll do well and you'll be successful. Well, there are systematic structural barriers and inequalities that don't allow that. And people from around the world would be able to talk about this in their own cultures and their own countries. But this individualism, and it's reflected in career development, it's all about you and your self-efficacy and your self-belief and satisfying yourself. All right, and your goals, and that's all that matters. It's not about service, it's not about contribution, it's not about duty, to sound like a real retired old colonel. It's about kind of self-actualization, this ghastly Maslow evidence-free notion of motivation that we should ultimately end up, I don't know, swanning around in caftans, sitting on pine scatter cushions, full of mindfulness, which incidentally, I noticed today, the latest research is suggesting makes absolutely no difference to brain structures, even if you've had 8 weeks of it. So yeah, yet another false prophet. So we're constantly grabbing at these techniques that we can do to ourselves. It's like we're pimping our ride. We're trying to turn ourselves into this ludicrous car with sort of LED lights and large engines, and as long as we pimp our car enough, we will be successful and we will make it. And I think this is a fundamentally wrong approach to education. And I think it's a fundamentally wrong approach to individuals. I don't think it leads to happiness. I don't think it leads to success. And I don't think it helps society. And I'm not suggesting those things are the hierarchy of priority either in saying that. So, these very simplistic notions, traditional notions in career development, first look within yourself, understand yourself, then understand the world, then put the two together. Well, you go and talk to any decent monk. They can spend their lives pondering themselves and the world and still have ultimately never solve, quote, the mystery. So, what's this notion of understanding yourself? I mean, you could spend 27 years in psychotherapy and do nothing more than whine. This notion that you can simply solve people are puzzles to be solved, and the world's the same, is fundamentally wrong. Dave Snowden talks about this as a complexity theorist. People are not puzzles to be solved, they're mysteries to be explored. So it sounds so logical. Understand yourself, understand the world. Well, you're constantly changing, and so is the world. So instead of understanding or mastering, instead do experiments, probe, sense, act, try things, see what happens, try and reinforce if it seems to be going the right way, damp it down if it isn't. That is essentially what we're doing constantly. Anyone here who's had the misfortune to be a parent will know what it's like trying to control or manage or nurture their children. You try things, and just when you think, I've got this down, I know, and they love fish fingers, I'll cook fish fingers for supper tonight, and then the little beggars will turn around and announce they no longer like fish fingers, right? And you're stuffed. Or I know how we can pacify them, put their favorite TV show on, I'll have a chance to write that paper, do that report, or do the work, and suddenly they get bored and they don't like it anymore because they're constantly changing and exploring. All right. So parenthood, there's no formula for parenthood, despite all of these self-help books out there suggesting that you can do that. And these overblown claims out of schools that we understand boys or girls, or we know how to educate. You know, I've heard enough of that over the years. It's marketing. That's what it is. It's marketing. It is not reality at all. And I think that, so we need this much more humble kind of approach to all of this. And if that's reflected in our practice, then we can inculcate that into the people who we work with. I think that we need to equip them with these tools of experimentation, of influence. And nearly all things worthwhile, nearly all, are communal exercises. They don't come just from within ourselves. Whether it's Shakespeare being influenced by Greek playwrights and political events, or whether it's changing something in your community, you need to bring people together, you need to reach out, and you need to connect to others. So work is, as Mark Savickas said, is inherently social. We are embedded in social systems, and we've really got to pay heedness to this. You know, people like Wendy Patnam and Emma McMahon have said very similar things for many years, you know, for the last 25 years, about you've got to take into account the environment, you've got to take into account these systems. And people go, oh, yeah. But then it turns into a checklist. Okay, ask them about their mum and dad. Ask them about politics. And that's not how it works. You know, and if you
tell us then in practical terms, what would it look like? So I think a lot of people use chaos and uncertainty, and when we're working with, you know, with students, people will often go, if it's that chaotic, why do I move forward? As they use it as a reason for inaction, whereas you're saying it's constant action and interaction. Yes. Talk us through that, because I love the concept of the edge of chaos. I think probably I live on the edge of chaos, as we all do, but I like that there's something that frames that, but often people get confused, and some of the people here might not be so familiar with chaos theory and the finer points of it. What does it look like in practice?
Well, it looks like coming out of lockdown, those of us who've experienced lockdown, that we don't want to go out again because we've forgotten how to converse with somebody in a restaurant, or forgotten how to be polite in a bus queue, or feel overwhelmed by it. So the more you treat your life like you're in lockdown. So in other words, you just watch the same shows on TV, you just socialize with the same people, you just read the same stuff, you just live in the echo chamber of social media or whatever it may be. Every time you do that, every time you make a choice to do the same thing over again, is a lost opportunity to explore, to be curious, and to practice taking risks, right? You know, if you stop crossing the road, eventually when you're compelled to do so, you may have forgotten how to do it, forgotten how to judge the speed of traffic, and it becomes a much greater risk. And it's to the point where you put off trying to do it again because it's so traumatizing. So we need to be constantly out there exploring and trying things. And we need to be very aware when we're falling into attractors of routines, and going over doing the same thing. Now that can be very useful. That's why they are attractive, because having ritual and routine is a way of communicating with others, because we know where we are with it. Whether it's all of us recognizing a red light means stop, or it means we'll have a meeting every third Wednesday, or whatever it happens to be. We need that for essential communication. That's really important. So there is this balance of the structure. This is the edge of chaos notion. These closed systems where we try and we make an effort to prioritize. So I will meet Trent on a Thursday afternoon, or I will be here on a Wednesday or a Thursday, or whatever it happens to be. That is important, and we make an effort and we try to prioritize that. But we also recognize that, you know, if Trent suddenly develops a real problem with a root canal and has to go for emergency dentistry, well, that's going to happen. It's going to interfere with that routine, and we need to have the flexibility to be able to change our plans. Now, that may seem like a relatively trivial kind of example, but we're doing it all the time. So we're actually living this all the time. But what we're not doing is actually explicitly teaching people these skills to probe and to explore and to recognize what they're doing most of the time is dealing with complex systems, which means they've got to constantly think about the context and not place all of the responsibility on the individual or the blame on the individual, or falsely empower them, or give them the impression they can be empowered to completely overcome everything in their circumstances. And you see this all the time. The dark side of all of this sort of celebration of the rags to riches stories you hear at conferences. This person came from poverty, and through their diligence and their brilliance and their persistence, they made it, neatly absolving the rest of us from actually doing anything about systematic poverty or lack of education, and subtly placing the influence back on those losers that didn't follow our hero's journey. And I think
that's the balance there. Where's the balance there? Because on one hand, we want to say that individuals have to be explicitly taught to experiment and take action. Yeah. And on the other hand, we don't want to say, yes, you can do everything and we have to address the system. Is it both sides?
Yeah, it is. It's absolutely both sides. And these things are intimately interacting with each other all of the time. So you can't look at one without looking at the other. You can't look at the person outside of the system. You've got to look at them always within the context with which they find themselves to work out what their next moves are. You know, going into a school, rolling up in your Jaguar to say, look at me, I went here once and you losers can be like me if you pull your finger out, ain't going to be motivational for most people. And in fact, it's just rubbing their noses in it. Recognizing where they're at and the context which allowed me this slippery path through to the Jaguar, that path may not be open, and trying to use case studies or examples and say we're just going to copy them isn't going to work. It fails time and time again because there's no recipe for success. There's no, this idea of generalized principles. People come up with these things because they can sell them in talks and books. But in fact, you've got to individualize this for each and every person. Two people in the classroom are going to have different home experiences, different reactions and relationships with their parents and extended family. And the complexity of that has to be respected, and the individual has to respect that as well. And that is going to lead to different opportunity structures for those individuals. Now, we try to level this stuff up as much as we possibly can, but equally, we've got to tailor this stuff at the individual level, which means we can't just dose out career education in some kind of commoditized way, one size fits all for everybody. And I think that's a really important point. And that is, that takes time, and it takes skillful practitioners. Some people say, oh, Jim Bright is saying, oh, you can't use a career plan, right? I'm out of business. Well, my first reaction to that was, no, it's far more work for you. I'm now beginning to think, well, if that's what you think career counseling is about, you should be out of business. And let's bring in some curious, open-minded, dynamic people like the ones who turn up to talks like this, who really want to get this and really want to help people and are prepared to actually model what it is that they want others to do.
The challenge for, particularly with young people, is obviously time. You're talking about an individualized approach, teaching people explicitly the skills, and we work with that challenge every day, obviously. But why are we still, is it just the system and the lack of curriculum time? Is that why we're still shortchanging young people in this area? Is that why it's still so underdone?
No, I think it's a whole range.
Really not understand what needs to happen.
I think there's a range of things. I think, there can be teaching staff that frankly don't have a clue because they've been their training has not equipped them to, and they've been led to believe that what they should be doing is setting goals or other rubbish like that, which don't work. And that is absolutely inherent. They themselves will be going through a process of nonsense like key performance indicators and annual reviews, which are generally fantasies. So they're stuck in this system as well. So it's very, very ingrained, a lot of this stuff, and it's going to take a lot of time for it to change, but it is changing. And major events like the ones we're seeing at the moment, and the realization of how interconnected the world is, the reason, you know, that if Chinese government locks down Shanghai, suddenly there's going to be material shortages because all of the ships can't get in and out with all the exports, which can have impacts all around the world. Or you can have the same thing with energy problems, which leads to people not being able to have lettuce on their fast food. You know, when you start to look at how interconnected things are, and examples like at the moment are brilliant, to go back to your opening point, are brilliant ways of demonstrating just how interconnected and mutually dependent we all are in society. You know, we are not Paul Simon's I am a rock, I am an island, I need no friends. That's not what we are. We all need friends, and we all need those connections. And I think that's where we have to start from this point of view of saying, okay, how can we develop effective networks? And this is not just networking in the traditional sense of give us a job. This is understanding the interdependencies as much as we possibly can, and recognizing we're never going to fully understand these things. That's why systems thinking in its traditional form doesn't work, because you can't map out all of the boxes and draw arrows to it. That's just another form of oversimplification. But what we can do is we can try things and keep trying things, and that's the best we can do. And sometimes those things are going to be spectacularly successful, and sometimes they're going to fail, right? But that's what we have to do, and then teach people the resilience to bounce back, set up the appropriate expectations, give people safe places to try things, and to encourage endeavor constantly, and building that up in individuals. And you know, this is not I don't want to come up with a recipe for this, and these are broad principles that will be applied in very different ways in very different circumstances. So I think that is kind of where we need to go with this. And clearly, from what I'm saying, is the emphasis has to be on the process, not the product. We need to stop obsessing with where am I going to be in 5 years' time? Where's my kid going to be in 5 or 10 years' time? You know, it's only a few weeks ago, there was a lot of media commentary that, you know, maybe we're facing nuclear war in the Ukrainian situation. There was a lot of media commentary on that, which I haven't heard that since I was a teenager, with CND and the marches, you know, nuclear disarmament talks and all that stuff in the late 70s with the Cold War. That's suddenly back on the agenda. Suddenly the button and pressing it has become an issue. So, you know, with that in mind, is it really sensible to talk about where we'll be in 10 years? Possibly we'll be all of us scattered and intermingled in a really unpleasant way. But let's not get too apocalyptic about this.
I think Candy Ho at the CDAA conference here a couple of weeks ago just talked about, you know, 5 years ago at this conference, there was a question about where will you be in 5 years' time, and 100% of people got it wrong. You know, it's true, but I think that what you've talked about in terms of obsessing around, you know, the answer and shifting to the process, I think that's the one thing we could take forward. You know, I think what we're doing is we have to simplify it for people, because it's such a fundamental shift from a goal and a plan and grabbing onto that certainty, that feels like a really simple way to express it to people, that we're teaching people the skills and a process.
I think that fundamentally underestimates people's capacity and is ultimately patronizing and insulting. So I disagree completely. And I think we must fight against this simplification thing. Keep it simple, stupid for stupid people only. And most people are not stupid. And I think it's absolutely corrosive, you know, and it comes down to this, you know, Jim, so in 3 words, what is chaos theory? Well, if you've only got time for 3 words, go away until you've got time to listen. It is the answer to that. We must resist that temptation to oversimplify. You know, Einstein made this point: make things as simple as possible, but no simpler. It's back to edge of chaos stuff. And I think the danger is oversimplification. And if you think you've got all the answers, you're certainly wrong. Okay, if you think you've got the solution, you are wrong. And I think you can start from that point. I think, as I say, I mean, I keep going back to constant probes, constant recognizing, constant awareness of the context in which you find yourself and trying to make the next move. What we should be doing is making the next move, not trying to win the game of chess. You know, if we go in with one strategy for the game of chess, irrespective of what our opponent's doing, I suspect you're going to lose every single time against a half decent chess player. And nature is a damn good chess player. So I think that we've got to learn this, how to strategize and make it up as we go along. And that means, again, constantly trying things out and regrouping and bouncing back when we've made a mistake or we've retrieved, you know, trying to retrieve the situation. That means not making wild gambles. That means doing educated guesses, doing things that we think might work. And if it does work, see if we can ramp it up real quickly. Okay, so that's like, it's what Dave Snowden would call catalyzing attractors, finding something which seems to be going well and then draw people towards it. He uses the lovely example of you know, having a birthday party for a bunch of 5-year-olds. You know, if sticking on the video, the Wiggles video, suddenly calms the brutes down, then put another one on, you know, and keep it going until eventually it may longer work, and then maybe it's time to feed them, you know. So that's what we want to do, and we also want to understand what the constraints are, you know, and that's really important in systems, is understanding the constraints, and all systems have them. And again, that's why this stuff about you can do anything you want is just patent nonsense, right? No stage of my life, at whatever varying fluctuating weights I've gone through, would I ever have been a contender for the 100 meters in the Olympics. And that is not down to motivation. That is simply down to physiology and genetics. It was never an option for me, unless there was only about 8 other people on the planet. So, you know, I think those constraints need to be recognized. And that sounds kind of unfashionable, and people will jump on that and think that you're sort of trying to reinforce that. Those constraints from one human to another are often trivial. The one I use is from a very artificial thing about running 100 meters. That's a very artificial thing we've just developed for sport. That's not actually particularly profoundly important. Most human beings are reasonably equal on most things and are reasonably capable within certain boundaries of doing a lot of different things. So it's not as limiting as it may sound. But there are other limits. I mean, the limits may simply be, well, the system says you've got to get a really high grade to get into medicine. Well, you need to recognize that and work within that, if that's what you're doing in terms of your career planning. You've also got to stop cats jumping on things. And you've got, so you have to create, so what you're doing is constantly exploring, trying new ideas, adapting to situations, recognizing that things are going to fail, recognizing if you're not failing, you're not trying hard enough. You need to actually bring on failure as a way of exploring. So I hope you can hear I'm saying over and over and over again, curiosity-driven exploration, doing small experiments, probing a situation, checking things out. Look, there are situations where things are very straightforward and where you pretty much understand all of the options. And examples of that are things like, you know, sometimes aspects of sports, like the rules of sports, are fairly black and white. You know, if the ball goes between the posts, you've scored a goal. If you put it through the hoop, you've got a point, etc., etc. So there are situations which are very sort of regular like that and machine-like. You know, if you've got a clockwork clock, there's cogs and wheels that work in fairly predictable ways, and if you apply yourself enough or get an expert in, they can work out exactly how it works, predict what happens, and also repair it. So there are systems which are like that, and recognizing whether we're dealing with one of those or whether we're dealing with a more open dynamic system is a first step. Trouble is, mostly in life, we've tried to apply closed system thinking like a clockwork machine to situations which are natural and biological. So the first step is identify what environment do you find yourself in. You know, we're not in Kansas anymore. You know, we're in Oz. We're in this magical world, and that's very different. So
I just want to get to a couple of questions that have come through before. Aaron, I think, asked a little bit earlier about the barriers you were talking about around the systemic barriers. I think we've talked a little bit about those barriers, both within the individual and outside of the individual. And that was from the kind of social justice versus the individual agency and self-actualization point of view. Kirsten has asked, can you give us a concrete example of how we can work with young people and our colleagues now that we know there's been a paradigm shift in the way we do education?
Yeah, I mean, actually, Trent, who's on this call, who's been at the coalface working with kids in schools, has produced lesson plans, along with another of my doctoral students, Tony Borg, using them in high schools about how to educate people based on the chaos theory of careers. So there are things that you can do. You could have lessons on the importance of exploration, taking an optimistic mindset into exploring situations, recognizing chance events and how to leverage those, or how to come back from those, how to develop curiosity, how to recognize how you're already coping well with chaos. We have a thing called the Exploring Chaos Checklist, which is just a way of acknowledging that you're already dealing with chaos. You can have exercises in developing flexibility, is another one. There are many things you can do. The things like the circles of influence, to start to understand the systems that you're in and how they are having an influence upon you. So reflecting on your parents, on teachers, on friends, on sporting heroes or other heroes. Those sorts of things can be done. Some of the work that Mark Savickas did about sort of, who are your heroes? What are the repeating themes in your memories that you bring out? They're pulling out what we call a fractal pattern, a repeating emerging pattern in your life, which is a chaos kind of notion. So there are quite a few practical, concrete things that you can do with the individual, bearing in mind that we are not trying to replicate 100-year-old thinking as typified in John Holland, that the result or the product of the career education is that they come up with a piece of paper saying, I will be a botanist, I will be a carpenter, or whatever other singing group they want to join. So I think that they would be, if you want very concrete examples, if you've got time, you could probably put Trent in the spotlight, who could probably give you some examples. My apologies to other people in the group who I'm sure are doing great things as well. I just know, because I've worked closely with Trent, that he has done that. So forgive me if you've also got your own examples. But in fact, put your hand up or comment and share them, because this is a good thing to do. I also want to make it really, really clear that I don't think I have all the answers, and nor does Robert Pryor, and we never said we did. So I don't want, it would be a mistake to sort of think that I've got a recipe for this, because that's not the way we're thinking about this stuff at all. And we still need a critical consciousness in this area. We still need more of you to embrace these ideas and start questioning them and developing them. And that's really important, because, Rob's now retired. I'm sort of not, but I can begin to see the horizon. So
no, you're not allowed yet.
Up on this stuff. Can't just be us. So that's also a really important aspect in this stuff. It's a long way off yet, but
yeah, that's great. And I think, we're seeing a lot through our own work with Become, and we're seeing schools increasingly try this earlier. And, when we're talking about a process, we're seeing people learn how be able to integrate it earlier and allow that space for experimentation, as Jim's talking about. I've realized my internet connection has just gone a bit wobbly. So apologize.
Yeah, the other point I would make, and again, I'll be interested to hear other people's views on this, is that when you level with kids and you teach them this stuff, well, they go, yeah, of course, I know that. That's kind of, it appeals to their natural experience of the world. It's generally not the kids who are sort of saying from an early age, I absolutely need to know what I'll be doing when I'm 27 years of age. That generally isn't kind of on their mind. And they intuitively recognize this stuff. It's the people who are invested in them, the parents and the teachers, and the family members who seem to get obsessed by this, or politicians who feel the pressure of the electorate breathing down their neck to do something about it, to funnel people into particular areas of demand. So I think that's worth bearing in mind as well, that if you're thinking of experimenting with this, be brave with it, and you'll find people are very open to it as an approach.
Jim, I often found introducing the parents to it was the best way to start. And I experimented a number of times over 15 years or so, but I used to love doing the careers collage with parents, because they love talking about themselves. So if you get them with a career collage and say, look, we're going to do this with your children in the next couple of weeks, this is how it works, and get them to show you when they bring it home. And also the checklist you spoke about is one of the lessons in the chaos theory education set. I do that with the parents on the night as well, and open the conversation with parents. Always found that get them on side first, and the rest will flow.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I remember talking at a very famous private school in Sydney back in 2005 about some of these ideas. And some of the people in the room were sort of, getting restless and wanted to walk out, because I was sort of talking about, the interconnected nation thing about sort of globalization, and how decisions being made in Brussels will impact you over here. And, just because you think it's high status now, it may not be in the future. And the parents found it very challenging. But I remember it was actually somebody, a very senior executive in a music company, came up to me and she said to me, this is exactly what we're experiencing in our business right now. You're on the money. But some others really did rattle their tiaras, the idea that their little poppets wouldn't necessarily make a fortune out of medicine or whatever it happened to be that they're interested in at the time. So getting the parents on board, I think, is a really important thing. And again, appealing to people's personal experience. Rob Pryor has the expression, chaos, you're standing in it. Get people to recognize the chaos in their lives, whether it's been unexpected health issues, a promotion, being in the right place at the right time, how their relationship started, all of these things, often unplanned events, is a good way in. I don't want to emphasize unplanned events as being the only thing. It's not all about uncertainty. It's about continual change and nonlinear change, and the interconnectedness of networks. But that's a good way of starting that conversation. And resist the temptation to tie up all the loose ends. Life is messy. Everything is messy. It's not straightforward. And so therefore, don't just sort of say, "Oh, tell your story, one narrative, and that's you done." That's another form of reductionism. And again, that's in our field. People have embraced narrative as, "Oh, wow, this is a real advance." Well, it's useful, but it's not the answer. And we need to get away from looking for magic pills that are going to be the answer. All we can do is give people a mindset and a few tools of inquiry, which are going to help them with their decision making, and in best understand what is at best uncertain. And that's what we're trying to, I believe that's what we're trying to do in career education, improve the quality of people's decision making so that they become more confident and able to start to understand how the dynamics of the networks and the context in which they find themselves, so that they can start to make a meaningful contribution and expect that contribution to change in its nature over time, and for them to be able to do that with grace.
That's I think that's a great note to wrap up on. Juliana's just talked about, yes, this is the perfect opportunity to promote non-linear career paths. And I think your point, Trent, about the parents, because it is a circle with young people, the parents are the demand of what are we going to get. And if they are being told the measurable things of a high ATAR and a great job, which are really easy to quantify and measure, become the things you can latch onto, we need to educate and be brave in a school strategy to say that isn't what we should be measuring. And a lot of the work around new metrics and people's own recognitions that careers are no longer linear, and this is the reassurance rather than the uncertainty. This is how we provide that reassurance and resilience once we've accepted that change is inevitable. So I think, yeah, the school strategy has to be addressed, and it has to be with the exec to be able to shift this and see how important and how powerful it can be. I think that point around resilience and adaptability comes up again and again. And I think teaching this is a real shortcut to that resilience and well-being that we're all striving to deliver in young people.
I mean, not surprisingly, the Parents Foundation, actually, their research has said that still the greatest influences in a young person's life is still the parents between 10 and 16. So it's not surprising that we need to start with them.
Yeah, absolutely. But there's also research that we can shift them into we can very easily shift those high influence, high support parents into supporters of this low influence and creating that safe space if we allow them to be valuable and informed about what is the best way to support. And that doesn't mean getting to the answer, telling them the answer, giving them the right advice and the answers. So
exactly. And I think for that reason, we need to get away from this obsession with seeing testing as the most central approach to career education and career development. Not only is it false that it tells the answer, it doesn't. Not only is it false that matching careers are somehow going to be better than other possibilities, it also subtly places a responsibility solely on that individual and totally disregards the context in which the person finds themselves. It's an oversimplification and encourages people to see themselves as static and the world as static. It actually sets up entirely inappropriate and positively Victorian view of the world. And people have got to realize this and not fall back on lame excuses. Oh, well, it's a way of starting a conversation. Well, there are lots of ways of starting a conversation. I could start a conversation by saying, God, you look ugly today. The conversation is not going to be very effective if I did, right? And this is the equivalent of doing that. So don't start conversations with bad probes.
It reinforces the narcissism.
Yes.
Yes, very good, Brent. You're absolutely right.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And thank you, Jim, for sitting in the hot seat about chaos today. It's really good to hear it again and the new angles and a refreshed viewpoint on what we take forward. And I think I agree, it is the chance to take things forward. I've dropped in some really key links. The next Reimagining Careers education session is there. And Jim's revamped, which you didn't give a plug to, your revamped career counselling, coaching and assessment course. There's a link to that there, which Zoe asked for. That gives a 25% credit to the ACU grad certificate, am I right?
It does, yes. This year it does, if you do the course. Yeah, and it's revamped. You say mine. The course is done in association with Become now. Liv is also involved in the presentation of it, and some of the tools and practical things that we are developing through Become will be introduced to you in that program. So we're really walking the talk. So we've gone through carefully, and the team at Become have revamped it with me. So it's refreshed. It's still pushing the line that you're hearing here today, because I'm very passionate about it. 20 years later, still am passionate, but now angry about it as well, probably. But it's, but yeah, so I would really strongly recommend it. If you've done it before, you may find a lot different in the course now. Not everything, but you'll find a fair bit of new stuff. If you haven't, seriously consider it, or let other people know. We really do need to move this area forward, and thank you for being here. That's the first step, and following and showing interest in our work. This drives what we do and Become as well. So we're really trying to walk the talk and develop those practical things that some of the people here today were asking for. Yeah, so there you go.
Thanks everybody for coming. Thank you, Jim. Thanks for all the questions. We'll stick around for a couple of minutes if anyone wants to ask a question in a smaller group.